In April 1971, a group of anti-war activists broke into an office building in Media, Pennsylvania. They were searching for records of the Selective Service System, the U.S. government agency in charge of drafting young men into the Army to fight in the Vietnam War. The activists planned to destroy any draft records they found. But the draft agency shared offices with the FBI, and accidentally, the activists discovered FBI files documenting many years of illegal war by the U.S. government against civil rights, anti-war, and other progressive movements. They had stumbled upon a highly secret official U.S. government program named the Counterintelligence Program, or Cointelpro. They didn't destroy the files, but leaked them to the U.S. press, breaking open the shocking story of Cointelpro.
Back in the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s, the United States government had programs, some involving simple surveillance, some involving ways of getting information, some involving plots, basically to frame people for crimes, and some involving outright murder.
It was secret at the time because it was by and large illegal.
Really what Cointelpro is a militarization of criminal justice.
It was a code word that was used by the FBI's actual war against the entire left movement.
To eliminate, intimidate, incarcerate, and terrorize a people.
It was a covert war strategy, and it was done because the government thought there was a war going on.
Locked up. Not everybody's locked up. That you can jail a revolutionary, but you can't jail a revolution.
In the 1950s, the U.S. government launched attacks against mass movements for social justice. This program was called Cointelpro. It was spearheaded by J. Edgar Hoover's FBI with the support of military and police agencies nationwide. The goal of Cointelpro, without pretense of legality, was to destroy leaders and organizations, to sow division and distrust. Of course, repression against peoples of color, poor and working people, and progressive organizations in the U.S. goes back hundreds of years, beginning with genocide against Native Americans and African slavery, as well as a war of conquest against Mexico and the colonization of Puerto Rico. Earlier in the 20th century, anarchists and socialists were imprisoned and deported. Later, there was intense repression and infiltration against the Communist Party and progressive trade unions. As the civil rights movement brought millions of people into new social consciousness, Cointelpro unleashed wider and more murderous onslaughts against the growing unity of movements for social change.
You were carrying out what you thought was official governmental policy, were you not?
Yes, sir.
And you thought you were doing what the President of the United States wanted you to do.
Despite congressional investigations, many of Cointelpro's crimes are not fully known. Activists who experienced it firsthand hold important lessons for the present and future.
Cointelpro was most active at a time when peoples around the world were fighting against U.S. imperialism. You had the war in Vietnam. You had countries in Africa struggling against colonialism and demanding independence. In Latin America as well. And then you also had within the borders of this country, people of color also struggling against white supremacy and for empowerment in their own communities.
Cointelpro's attacks on left-wing organizations and against the civil rights and black liberation movements have received some attention, But it's less well known that one of Cointelpro's first targets was the movement for Puerto Rican independence. In 1897, Puerto Rico was granted autonomy by the Spanish Empire, only to be invaded by the United States in 1898. Since then, Puerto Ricans have struggled against U.S. colonialism, led by activists like Pedro Albizu Campos. By the mid-1950s, as movements for independence surged around the world, the Puerto Rican National Liberation Movement had reached a new and impressive strength. In 1950, the Nationalist Party attempted to assassinate President Harry Truman, and in 1954, 4 nationalists attacked the U.S. Congress.
One of the first documents that the FBI issues, that J. Edgar Hoover issues, that constitutes what could be called a Cointelpro document, was really issued against the Puerto Rican independence movement. In this missive that J. Edgar Hoover sends out to the San Juan office is that everything has to be done, that you should gather all pertinent information, including personal information, on the independence leaders to expose them, that would lead to divisions, that would lead to disruption and the destruction of the movement. In 1978, it's revealed that there are files on 165,000 adults in Puerto Rico. While in Puerto Rico, in order to get a job, you had to have a certificate of good conduct. Who issued the certificate of good conduct? The Puerto Rican police. But if you had a file, you didn't have a certificate of good conduct. What did this mean? It meant that Puerto Ricans who were in any way associated with the Puerto Rican independence movement or were supportive of the Puerto Rican independence movement had a file on them, and it was very difficult for them to get jobs in Puerto Rico. It was all driven by the FBI, and it was part of the FBI's Cointelpro program that these files were kept.
Not only were files kept, but organizers and activists were targeted in other ways by the U.S. government. The Cointelpro activities of police agencies led to the setup and murder of Puerto Rican independence fighters Carlos Soto Arivi and Arnaldo Dario Rosado in Cerro Maravilla in 1978. In the United States, the Cointelpro program reacted to the growing organization and militance of the Puerto Rican community. An FBI informant in Chicago infiltrated an activist family, spread vicious rumors, and was responsible for the imprisonment of leaders.
We had an FBI informant, Rafael Marrero, that married my sister. He was totally involved in the political work. He really knew how to do political work, and he wasn't lazy. But I remember talking to my sister about this because he never had a job, even though he did political work. My sister fed him, my sister clothed him, my sister was raising their daughter.
The destructive personal and political betrayals of FBI infiltrator Marrero took place at a time when both of his wife's sisters, Lucy and Alicia Rodriguez, were political prisoners.
He was just a leech, you know, and personally, and then a leech in the movement, and then he leaves, and then all these awful things that he did to you know, against people that I knew were giving of their life and their essence to the struggle.
A prominent activist imprisoned due to his actions was Jose Solis, a professor of education in Chicago who was charged in connection with an attempted bombing of a military recruiter that had in fact been set up by Marrero.
That's what Rafael Marrero, who was the agent stationed here, was supposed to do. Actually did carry out a bombing, and he tried to then put the blame on Puerto Rican activists and people who promoted Puerto Rican independence.
Jose Solis spent many years in prison, and his marriage broke up and his children suffered.
The FBI takes no responsibility, yet in the case of Rafael Marrero, we know that he was paid several $1 million to carry out what he did. He was wine and dine in the best hotels. We had all the evidence that was revealed through the discovery documents of Jose Solis' case. And yet the FBI assumes no responsibility for that.
The U.S. government continues to target the Puerto Rican independence movement and to imprison Puerto Rican activists.
The FBI, in its own words, saw a real threat in what I would term the efforts towards self-determination and community empowerment. And not only in the Black Panther Party, but certainly the Young Lords in the Puerto Rican movement and other organizations.
The story of Native American resistance extends back more than 500 years. It's a struggle that has never ceased. In the 1960s, it underwent a resurgence highlighted by the occupations of Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay and of Wounded Knee and the Pine Ridge Reservation, one of the many areas where, in 1890, the U.S. Army committed genocide. There were numerous other demonstrations and occupations demanding sovereignty and upholding treaty rights. In the wake of the uprising at Wounded Knee, FBI and Bureau of Indian Affairs supported goon squads, attacked people who fought for human rights and sovereignty. Many local Native activists were killed or imprisoned, and some leaders, such as Leonard Peltier of AIM, the American Indian Movement, were framed and to this day remain in prison.
The early 1970s, the American Indian Movement began asserting treaty rights within the rubric of national liberation movements to restore active sovereignty to Native nations. So you have basically the FBI, that is a law enforcement agency as it's chartered within the United States, fulfilling a counterinsurgency function on American Indian reservations, particularly the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota, but others as well, during the mid-1970s.
I was based here in San Francisco and on the AIM Council for the San Francisco Bay Area. So we were getting reports from everywhere. You know, Pine Ridge was just one place we were dealing with after Wounded Knee. I think they cared more about the grassroots leaders, getting rid of them, than about the, the national spokespeople. But these local leaders, incarcerating them and, they were destroyed. They were destroyed by it. They created these, what we would later learn from Central Americans were death squads, to just kill leaders, to terrorize people, break into houses and start shooting people, and just a free reign of weapons being provided, and especially ammunition, really armor-piercing, hollowed out, these kinds of things that are military issue, being given to these guardians of the Oglala Nation. They call themselves the Goon Squad.
The emblematic case to come out of the FBI campaign, the counterinsurgency campaign against the American Indian Movement during the 70s, is of course that of Leonard Peltier. And that's an individual who was part of an armed security team on Pine Ridge that was willing to go toe-to-toe with the FBI and its surrogates, the death squad surrogates that were mustered out of the Bureau of Indian Affairs police there in order to